As we get deeper into the affairs of this potential new nation in East Africa, emerges a certain surprisingly well-known country to the Western world, Uganda. Uganda is very much a country with potential for the future. Ambitious plans and a self-declared democracy, as well as a shockingly large population, give this land with its mineral resources great paths to follow in the future. A Swahili hinterland with the capacity for manufacturing industrialization and realizing the ambition of the Uganda Vision 2040 project may be a new force among its fellow landlocked nations in Africa. This relatively small country, dependent largely on the biggest lake in Africa, Lake Victoria, lies between two main rifts in the Great African Rift Valley, the Albertine Rift and the Grigori Rift. To the south, in a region below the equator, the tail end of the Rwandan Virunga Mountains, with the rest of the country generally being higher than its northern neighbours but still relatively set in hills. Due to its enormous fracturing by lakes, wetlands constitute a large amount of water in the region, used primarily in agriculture but potentially also the emerging manufacturing sector. Divided into 4 major regions and 11 districts, and the capital Kampala near the shores of Lake Victoria, Uganda also has within it 5 autonomous kingdoms, being the Toro, Busoga, Bunyoro, Buganda and Rwenzururu, historical tribes populating the Great Lakes region. Uganda's history is so similar to those mentioned already, but its modern history starts upon its peaceful independence from Britain in 1962, where it became an elective monarchy under the name the Sovereign State of Uganda, with the 5 regional kings electing a president. This lasted until 1967, where it became a democratic republic. This said, no democratic election ever actually occurred as the Prime Minister, Milton Obote, resumed his office before the declaration until a coup in 1971. This coup was caused by tensions between the government and the army inflamed after putting down a Ugandan uprising. Idi Amin, the leader of the army and prior to this a very loyal supporter of Obote's regime, was accused of too high military spending and even assassination attempts, as well as unauthorized rebel support in the South Sudan, still part of Sudan at the time. Obote decided to assume full control of the military, demoting Idi Amin. With this, Amin and a large portion of the military decided upon executing a coup d'etat, and with the support of the UK and the US, the rebels managed to establish Amin as president, although he very quickly became a military dictator. About 45,000 Ugandans were executed under his regime, with refugees forming militias in neighbouring Tanzania, who re-invaded in 1972 but were crushed. The Ugandan economy suffered enormously and many human rights violations occurred. However, the country somewhat managed to stick together due to the absolute brutality of Idi Amin. Nicknamed the Butcher of Uganda, he expelled the 80,000 Asians and various Europeans living there, redistributing much of the land to the unskilled native population, which proved disastrous for the economy. Then came the persecution of the Ugandan Christian Church in 1978, culminating from increasing religious tensions between Ugandan Muslims and Christians. At the end of 1978, the Ugandan Tanzanian War began as Idi Amin accused Tanzania of subverting Uganda, as relations had deteriorated between them since the invasion of refugees back in 1972 from Tanzanian bases. Now, Uganda sent its army across the border, managing to annex a section of land but soon meeting the bulk of the Tanzanian Reserve Army, retreating but destroying itself from attempting to loot as much as it could. The Tanzanian army quickly made ground, capturing Kampala about 4 months later on the 11th of April 1979. This brought an end to Amin's regime and brought about the modern Republic of Uganda and the restoration of Milton Obote as Prime Minister. In 1981, the country collapsed again into civil war, with then the rule of the victor Yoweri Kaguta Museveni starting in 1986, which has lasted until present day. One last thing to mention is the Lord's Resistance Army. This is a group that, although much less of a threat today, was historically an incredibly violent insurgency, perhaps the worst Africa has ever seen. It only had a maximum of 6,000 members in 1998, being just 240 in 2014, however due to knock-on effects killed over 100,000 people and displaced 400,000 more. It was and still is led by the infamous Joseph Kony, a man who is devoutly romantic with the idea of overthrowing the Ugandan government and replacing it with his idea of a Christian theocracy based on his interpretation of the Ten Commandments. The group operates with extremely brutal guerrilla warfare tactics, remaining largely untraceable by Uganda's army but carrying out devastating raids on their population, killing or abducting hundreds at a time. Surprisingly, despite support from numerous other countries, Uganda took about 20 years to actually quell the insurgency, forcing its members into the jungles of the Central African Republic. This has wrought utter devastation to northern Uganda, and it is a great fortune that this region has many potential future oil supplies, or a situation may have arisen where the south, where the capital Kampala and the economically critical Lake Victoria are located, would see huge inequality in terms of wealth with the north. Geopolitics was a field held closely by the late Kategaya, the first Deputy Prime Minister of Uganda and an important Minister of East African Community Affairs. The Kategaya Doctrine, a term coined by writer Charles Onyango Obo, is a doctrine concerned with expelling foreign countries who lease large amounts of land from countries in Africa, reportedly 115 million acres in 2012, when simultaneously African countries are some of the only in the world to lack reliable food security. This policy may see economic potential for Africa and furthermore to Uganda. However, another economic element beyond agriculture may be what this small nation needs. Uganda discovered oil in 2006. This revelation makes it immediately 100,000 times more valuable to the outside world, as is often the case when such a resource is discovered in a developing country, such as with Saudi Arabia. Due to this being a very recent discovery, there is now fresh competition between Kenya and Uganda to see who can build the best pipeline to the East African coast. The obvious route is through Kenya. However, due to the immense rivalry between these two countries, it might end up going through Tanzania instead. Both of these routes will get it to the Indian Ocean, to freedom, to the outside world. It needs to reach here, and will likely make a desperate bid to get there. However, it will have to side with one of its rival friends to get it. Favouring one side will likely infuriate the other, but perhaps a more diplomatic situation is resolving it through the East African community. Tanzania is certainly safer due to Kenya's presence of the Islamic terrorist group Al-Shabaab in the northeast, but the Tanzanian route is longer and will likely be more expensive due to the inherent stability and safety of the pipeline. To kind of prove how recent this stuff is, I mean, one day ago at the time of writing, a deal was signed with Tanzania for $3.5 billion to lay down the pipeline, so I suppose we can add to geopolitics that the deal with Tanzania was the one that went through, interestingly. The British, Chinese and French were originally the dominators of Uganda's oil extraction industry and thus their economy until the Russians came in 2015, which has soured relations between Uganda and the US. Uganda lacks the institutions and experience to reasonably nationalise its oil, thus it must rely on foreign countries for development of sources. Now that Uganda has a pipeline to the Indian Ocean, who can tell where the balance of power will shift? One can assume that China will naturally take up this vacuum, being geographically closer and strengthening its foothold in Africa and the Indian Ocean by the day, with the West being put to one side. Looking to its southern border reveals its main rival, Rwanda. This has been mentioned earlier in the documentary, but to recapitulate, these two countries are adversaries, mainly due to naturally similar sizes and economies, and a bid for dominance in an isolated region. Uganda's relation with Rwanda has declined significantly, as the regime dislikes immensely Paul Kagame's RPF, perhaps from envy at his competent leadership, but also from the psychotic obsession that either side is close to attempting a coup or invading one another. After the border between the two is closed, no agreement yet has been reached, and it is highly possible that either side will initiate a war. Recently, Museveni stated to the Rwandans ominously, "Once we mobilize, you can't survive." Unless this jealousy can be stoked, Uganda or Rwanda is likely to collapse into chaos once again, as although Uganda's larger size and larger populations could most likely crush Rwanda, there may be genuine allies Rwanda can rely on, such as the paternal peacekeeper in the region, Tanzania. This said, previously mentioned in the documentary were the wars in the Congo, which were actually primarily executed by Rwanda and Uganda's support of the M23 rebel group in the Congo's east, around Kivu. This proves how the two countries can team up and truly be a military force as well as an economic power. Rwanda's economy is booming and the closing of the border is hurting only Uganda. With the shadow of the EAF in the future, perhaps cooperation is possible. Uganda is called and calls itself a democracy. However, since independence it has never had a peaceful transfer of power, with President Museveni seen as a democratic reformer despite being in power for 30 years. Over time, he becomes, quote, increasingly repressive of political dissent, which may partially be attributed to the view that political disorientation and polarization has been a bottleneck for Uganda and one of the stifling factors of its growth, with the more likely explanation being that Museveni is just trying to further entrench his power. Museveni is in his 70s, likely to pass soon, and one of the reasons he clings on is because he believes he is the only one who can manage Uganda's future oil industry correctly. As he must surely die in the period of Uganda's oil production, the successor must be gifted in managing the relative peace the country is currently in. However, due to Uganda's lack of precedent of a peaceful, democratic power change, it is likely that the next leader will be selected in a scenario that, at worst, will be a brutal civil war. Something in Africa one does at least have precedent for. But let us look for a more optimistic future. Uganda is in the Ascendant Manufacturing Countries defined group, which encompasses several East African countries and proves that Uganda and the East African community as a whole may be real economic contenders in the future, as industrialization and manufacturing are the key to developing a nation into a modern state. This region certainly has the population to do it, with Uganda, despite its tiny size, various humanitarian and refugee crises and callings, being home to about 43 million people. Much like Rwanda's view of the Singapore of Africa, Uganda's current roadmap is the Uganda Vision 2040 project, intending to make Uganda, quote, a transformed Ugandan society from a peasant to a modern and prosperous country within 30 years, end quote. It also states, quote, Uganda Vision 2040 builds on the progress that has been made in addressing the strategic bottlenecks that have constrained Uganda's socio-economic development since their independence, including ideological disorientation, a weak private sector, underdeveloped human resources, inadequate infrastructure, small market, lack of industrialization, underdeveloped services sector, underdevelopment of agriculture, and poor democracy, among others, end quote. This may coincide with a spell of disaster, however. If Uganda reaches prosperity by 2040, power might collapse soon afterwards as oil production will only last 30 or so years according to current estimates. Much of this oil is located in places which are touristically and biologically important, such as the Murchison Falls National Park and Lake Albert, where unrestricted oil exploitation in the pursuit of short-term wealth may have devastating long-term impacts as key tourism locations, which seem to be the economic future of sustainability in Africa, could be destroyed and thus rendered unutilizable in the coming years. Uganda may utilize instead its God-blessed geographical features such as the beautiful Lake Victoria, or at this point the infantile River Nile, in order to have a future for its large population's imminent future.